Bro, fucking Amanda's in my class. She just turned her video on for like 3 seconds.
In progress.
A lot of people have 9:30s on Tuesday and Thursday.
AKA me.
Well, yeah, me too.
Mr. Riddle is watching you, Lori. Mr. Riddle is 87. Just to watch. Probably all he can. What's the pumpkin for? I brought it for Tommy and figured carving a jack-o'-lantern to keep him occupied. I always said you'd make a fabulous Girl Scout. Thanks. For that matter, I might as well be a Girl Scout myself.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Hi.
Hello, hello. Thanks for being flexible. I'll keep you informed, but I would say probably assume we'll also meet this way on Thursday as well. But like I said, I will keep you up to date. So today we're going to keep going over the sensory system and talking about the agnosias. And so we'll focus primarily on the visual focused ones, but we will talk about some of the other senses as well. So I was just in the process of trying to get Blackboard to cooperate with me. I don't know if I'm going to have luck. Give me a second. It was just like being really slow. But I do have lots of videos to show. Yeah, here we go. And then I got my other PowerPoint that I might reference as well. Okay. So I didn't get a chance to grade your quizzes yet, mostly because a lot has gone on in the past few days. So I will plan to get to those in the next few days. The other thing I wanted to say is just keep on top of your readings and your SGAs as much as you can. Our next quiz isn't till the 23rd, so we do have a little bit. And then I did have someone ask me a really good question about the SGAs. So at the beginning, we have lots of chapters that we run through, so you like have an SGA every class. From here on out, you'll tend to more often have one like every 2 classes. So just know that, like, so for today, you didn't have an SGA due, right? And then you'll have one due Thursday, but then not the following Tuesday. That will become more of the norm. So I think everyone knows Zoom pretty well, hopefully at this point. If you go to the bottom and you click chat, feel free to put comments in that way or to say you have something to say. You can also use the raise hand feature as well. And I'll be able to see that. Yeah, and we'll just do the best we can with this. Hopefully we will be able to be back in person by next week at the latest. So I did want to start with a video, and this is off of a DVD. I feel so dated. That came from your book, actually, the people who make your book. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen. Okay. Let me maximize that so it's not really pixelated for y'all. Okay. And there we go. Hopefully this will work and hopefully you'll be able to hear it.
Gradually, neuroscientists are building up a detailed map of this parallel processing. The raw jumble of information from the eyes travels to the primary visual cortex and on to a series of increasingly specialized areas for processing. So far, over 30 different areas have been discovered, working on motion, color, depth, shape, what they all do, but recently, an underlying logic to this assortment of areas has been uncovered.
Okay, so if you close your eyes.
These 2 bars are exactly the same size. It seems as though my visual system has been totally fooled by this illusion. But this experiment proves that's not the case.
Okay, if you open your eyes again, can you tell me which looks longer, if either of them do?
Yes, this one looks longer.
Fine, okay. And when I say...
The precise movements of my fingers are tracked by a special set of cameras as I reach for the bars.
Perfect.
If my entire visual system has been fooled, then my grasp should be wider for the bar that looks bigger.
And open them. And tell me again, are they the same or different?
No, this looks bigger.
Okay, so when I say go pick up the one on the right, 2, 1, go. Great.
The movements of my fingers reveal a fascinating aspect of the workings of my brain. The bars look different lengths, but my fingers shape to pick them up in exactly the same way for each. Part of my visual system, which is guiding my hand, has not been tricked by the illusion and is acting independently of what I'm consciously seeing. This kind of ingenious research shows that all the specialized visual areas are organized into 2 different pathways with very different roles. One pathway, which was guiding my hand, helps us interact with the world. We're unaware of it, but every movement we make is fed by information from this pathway. The more laborious task of recognizing what things are is handled by a different pathway. Maybe that's so we don't have to wait until we know what something is before we move to deal with it.
Okay, so you can see even in a quote unquote normal person, right, someone without any sort of brain damage, these things can play tricks on us, and how our vision interacts with other things end up, you know, not always being on the same page. So it's always really interesting to think about that. I wanted to next talk a little bit just about the visual system in general. So for those of you who have taken things like, biopsych or even Psych 101, some of this will be a review, but I think it's also helpful to go back over. But I'm going to start, and I'm going to just throw these terms in the chat so you know what I'm saying as we go through. Let's start by talking about the different functions of vision. So the first one that we talked about on your SGA is vision. Again, I'm going to throw the terms in the chat. So what is that? Again, you can type in the chat, you can raise hand, you can unmute yourself, whatever is easiest for you. Oh, there we go. Seem to be able to interact with the environment around us. Thank you, Will, for breaking the ice. I appreciate it. I know it's hard when we have been in person to move to this format. So yeah, it's the visual processing required to direct specific movements. So think about things like when you go to pick something up, right? So I'll put, actually I can just show it here, right? So if I'm going to pick up my glasses case, I sort of look where it is and then I pick it up. If I try to do it without, right, I'm sort of like feeling around and I'll eventually find it, especially if I've seen before where I left it, right? So that's vision for action. It has to do with things like reaching, ducking, catching, the parietal visual areas in the dorsal strand. We're going to look at what that means in a minute. I have some diagrams I'll show. All right, next we have action for vision. What does that mean? Yes, exactly. So Will's spot on, and I hope y'all will start helping Will out as well. That is searching for only part of the object or the target object and attending to that, paying most attention to that. This is sometimes also called visual scanning, and it uses eye movements and selective attention. And in particular, we use this like when we look at faces, we tend to focus on people's eyes and their mouths because they tell us the most socially. All right, I'll bail y'all out with the next few. So the next one is visual recognition. It's just what it sounds like. It's object recognition. This is done more in the temporal lobes. And then visual space is done in both the parietal and temporal lobes, so side of your head. And this has to do with spatial location. So the location of an object relative to us, and then the location of us relative to the object, and the location of objects relative to each other, right? That becomes important as well. And then the last one we'll touch on here is visual attention. And that's selective attention for specific visual input. Selective attention for specific visual input. So again, this uses the parietal lobes up here. And these guide the movements. And then the temporal lobes, sort of again by your ear, help in object recognition. So it's the two working together. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share screen again. Find the right place. Okay. And so this is a PowerPoint that I can't take credit for. This is one that was presented online and freely available to folks to cover this material. I'm just going to pull up the chat in case anyone does have questions. I'll be readily able to look at it. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on captions so that if y'all are having any connectivity issues, difficulties hearing me, you will be able to get at least a gist of what I'm saying. It uses the Google algorithm, so it's decent, but it's not always the best. So, all right. So this is the organization of the sensory systems. And as you can see, it's pretty complicated, right? So you've got your peripheral sensory receptors. And then some of them do have to go through the spinal cord. With the eyeball, the retina is the part where we talk about specifically. It doesn't have to go to the spinal cord because that would kind of take you around and out of the way, right? So instead you've got the optic nerve, which goes right to the lateral genital nucleus. So that's the sensory thalamus. Then our primary sensory cortex here is the primary visual cortex. Maybe not surprisingly, there's a visual association cortex, and then there's a multimodal association cortex. That's specific for vision. So this is what the eye looks like. Again, if you've taken Psych 101, this should look at least vaguely familiar, right? And so you heard me mention the retina, right? And so the retina is the layer of photoreceptive cells on the back of our eye. That's where our rods and cones are. Cones do color, C and C. Rods help us distinguish like dim light settings. The fovea is a special part of the retina that's for high visual acuity. There's a lot of cones there, fewer rods. And then the optic nerve, and I won't go too much into the biology of this, but essentially this is where the axons of the neurons that start in the eye go back so that they can communicate information to the visual cortex. So the blind spot in our eye is actually where the optic nerve is, and it's where these axons leave our eye. Okay, so this gives you a nice idea about the bilateral projections. So each eye gives us information about both the right and left sides of our visual field. So for me, it'd be right and left. For you guys, it'd be right and left, right? And so those are combined back in the visual cortex. And as you can see, information about the left side of the visual field is combined and sent to the right side. And the information about the right side of the visual field is combined and sent to the left side, and then it's flipped back there. Here are those areas I was just talking about and how they are involved. There are at least 25 distinct regions of that visual cortex, but we still don't know exactly what all of them do. So these are all of the visual areas that we are like at least somewhat aware of, right? And how they navigate through parts of the brain, so like the temporal cortex. And I'm just going to sort of skip through these, but show you the diagrams. Just, I mean, I would never want you to memorize something like this, right? But it just gives you an idea of how complex this is, right? That there are all these different visual areas that are associating with a lot of other things, right? It's got to tie to memory so that we can recognize things. You know, it eventually has to tie to our outgoing messages to our limbs to move things. This is kind of a fun activity. I don't know how well this will work on your screens, but go ahead and close your right eye. Mine will look like your left eye probably, and focus on, they're calling the X, the cross. And then kind of go like this, move your head back and forward until like you can't really see the dot anymore. You might need to be closer to the screen than I am. And that's essentially the blind spot in your visual field. Now, the reason we have you close one eye in order to do that is because when both eyes are open, they compensate for each other and they fill in that blind spot. So we don't have a permanent blind spot when both eyes are open. And you can do this as well, and the line will appear to still be there. So here you can see again some of the different things these different areas of visual, the visual cortex do. So areas that are focused just on color recognition, for example. So here is an example of maybe what Michael, our case study guy, had damaged. You know, he had achromatopsia, so he probably had damage to V4, right? So inability to perceive color. They'll see the world more in black and white. And so here, these areas are focused on visual memory and facial recognition. So again, if you're experiencing that prosopagnosia, that's probably what's going on here. All right, this is a case study. I'll actually get to blind sight later. I'll stop there for now. Let me stop sharing, but that at least hopefully gives you some better idea of sort of how complex these things are. We tend to just think like the eyes, go to the back of the skull, that's the occipital lobe, and then we're good to go, right? But in fact, it's actually fairly complex. So I want to talk more about the different types of agnosias, and then we'll talk about blind sight today, and we'll also talk a little bit about synesthesia today, which is kind of a fun disorder to talk about. And some people argue it's maybe not even a disorder at all. So, so the first person, oh, you have synesthesia? Nice. Okay, Brenda, when we get to that, I'll definitely want you to fill in if you're feeling comfortable doing so. All righty. So the very first person to describe and actually coin the term visual agnosia was our good friend Freud. So good old Sigmund Freud, the cigar guy, right? The guy who invented talk therapy, essentially. He also tried to codify some of the disorders that his patients were experiencing. And there are a lot of different types of agnosia. So we'll spend a little bit of time going over each. The first one we'll talk about is apperceptive agnosia. Okay, and this is a deficit in the ability to develop a percept of the structure of an object or objects. So a percept is sort of your whole viewing of a thing, right? My ability to look at this thing and say, here, I'll do the like influencer thing so you guys can kind of see it's a highlighter, and say like, this isn't just a yellow line, right? Or if I look at it from this way, a white tube, right? If you look that way, that's kind of what it looks like. But I can look at this whole thing and say, this is a yellow highlighter. It's by Sharpie, even. I can tell you the brand name, right? So things like acuity, visual acuity, being able to actually see is preserved. You would still have color vision, you'd still be able to perceive motion. And this ends up happening when you have bilateral damage in the occipital lobes. So you have to have fairly intensive damage, although unfortunately the occipital lobes are a fairly frequent place to get injury, because if you fall backward, right, if you like pass out and nothing catches you, you might hit your head there. Or as we've mentioned previously, if you're, say, playing something like American football, right, and you smack your helmet into someone, your brain's first gonna like hit that, and then it's gonna rebound and hit back here. And anytime your brain kind of moves like that, you can also have rotation or even tearing of the neuron axons. And obviously that's gonna cause damage as well. All right, the next one, I think I've been teaching this course for like 8 years, and I've never fixed this on the SGA. So I think your SGA still might say multagnosia. It's supposed to be simultagnosia. So apologies if it's still wrong. But this is being unable to perceive more than one object at a time, right? So if I held these up, right, I can tell there's a pen and a highlighter. And I can also tell that behind me, I have like my women in psychology bag and my trusty fan and the hallway, right? I can see all that and kind of process it all together. Someone with simultagnosia could really only focus at one thing at a time. They're like, okay, what do you see? And they go, a highlighter, anything else, right? And then you could kind of like see them shifting their vision, and then they might be able to say, oh, a pen, right? But they can't process it all together. Then there's associative agnosia. So this is where you can perceive objects but can't identify them. So this is what Michael had. This is what the woman who couldn't identify like her glasses or the keys that we watched the video about last week had as well. And so this is someone who might be able to copy a drawing or draw something if we have like look at this and try to draw it, but they couldn't tell you what that is until they feel their hand physically doing something. And it results from lesions to the anterior temporal lobes. Remember, posterior is behind, anterior is forward. So anterior temporal lobes somewhere around here, you know, people can't see, there we go, like ahead of the ear, there we go. All right, next is alexia. And yes, this is the same root as dyslexia. So dyslexia is a dysfunction in your ability to read. Alexia or alexia is an inability to read. So it's a form of object agnosia, where you're unable to recognize words or letters, essentially, as if they were the objects in object agnosia. So they have an inability to construct perceptual wholes from the parts. So it can be seen as a form of object agnosia, or it can be seen as a form of associative agnosia, where essentially your word memory is damaged or inaccessible and you can't get to it. And it tends to be damaged on the left side of the brain, and that's because that's where our language centers tend to be. I shouldn't say tend to be, they don't tend to migrate around people's brains. All right, next you have visuospatial agnosia. So that's topographical disorientation. It's your inability to find a way around familiar environments, like say your neighborhood, or you know, sometimes even your house. You might not recognize landmarks. People who have visual spatial agnosia, who have a difficulty navigating the world around them, often also have prosopagnosia, that face blindness. So this is obviously tough. One thing that's important here is if this occurs in isolation and with, you know, damage to the visual cortex, then we know it's visual spatial agnosia. You can also have similar symptoms in the context of dementia, right? So if you have someone who has Alzheimer's disease, dementia of the Alzheimer's type, right? And they're experiencing this, it's probably not also agnosia, it's probably a memory issue primarily. So this is where like that differential diagnosis really comes into play, doing those neuropsychological tests and brain scans to really try to get at where is damage becomes important. Other things that I think are really important that I believe I did not have in your SGA. So you can have auditory agnosia. And that's the inability to recognize sounds in spite of your hearing being just fine. And there are a couple different types of this we tend to see. One is called pure word deafness. And that's auditory agnosia for speech. So you could hear that the person is making sounds, but you wouldn't recognize them as words, right? Just like Alexia, only for hearing. And then there's also auditory sound agnosia, and that is not recognizing non-speech sounds. So all those farm animal sounds we learn when we're a little kid, right? You wouldn't necessarily recognize, you wouldn't recognize the sound of an airplane or something like that. You can also have tactile, where you couldn't recognize stuff by feel, right? So if I had my eyes closed and I picked this up, I can say, yeah, this is a pen, no problem, right? This is one of my pens that has the cushy grip right here. It's got a clicker, right? If I had a tactile agnosia, I couldn't tell you what that is unless my eyes were open. Okay, so it's like the opposite of some of the visual agnosias, or you can tell by touching something, but not by seeing it. All right, and then we've mentioned already prosopagnosia. And this is your inability to recognize faces, right? And this is really tricky for humans in particular, because we are such visually related beings and socially related beings, right? So it can be really, really tricky for folks to navigate the world when that happens. So I have a couple videos I'm going to go ahead and screen share with y'all related to prosopagnosia. I know we watched Oliver Sacks last week, but I wanted to show you a couple more so you get a little bit better vibe for what it's like actually living with prosopagnosia. So here is one that we'll start with, and then we'll do the one about trying to treat prosopagnosia.
Your mouth is getting tired.
Meet Terry Sweeney, a professional photographer. She was a firefighter until an injury damaged part of her social brain, the circuitry she uses to recognize faces. The disorder is called prosopagnosia. For example, the person Terry has been photographing here is her mother. Now, because of her injury, Terry can't recognize any face.
Make me smile.
Not even her own mother's.
I'm really grateful you don't drink a lot of coffee.
In this test, Terry takes a Polaroid picture of her mother.
Terry, you just took a picture of your mother. And I want you to take a look at these and see if any of them are the picture you took or not. They may.
Now, Massachusetts General Hospital researcher Dr. Nancy Etkoff shows Terry several Polaroids with only faces showing and asks Terry to pick out her mother.
You know.
Okay, if you had to guess, which looks to you the most like your mother? Just looking now, you can't tell which one of these. None of these really look like your mother to you.
No.
Okay.
If you just cover up the face and I just look at the clothes, I can tell you.
Okay, do you want me to uncover them? Okay, why don't I do that? I'll uncover them so you can see what they're wearing and other parts of the picture.
And see, that's her, because the pink and purple shirt.
The shirt. You recognize the shirt.
It's the hardest, I think, with my family, not to be able to personalize them with a face or a sense of timing. You know, it's kind of like I've lost everybody, like everyone's gone, and all that I'm really left with are facts without faces, you know?
When Terry looks at these slides of famous faces, she can't recognize them, although other cues like hairstyle prompt a guess.
Is that Madonna? Because her hair, look at her hair.
It's Marilyn Monroe.
Oh, really? I always feel like I'm struggling and always feel like I'm fumbling through myself to find a connection, to find a bridge that'll just pull everybody right back all of a sudden.
Can you tell who that is?
No.
Okay. I said Bruce Springsteen.
That's not Bruce Springsteen, is it?
Why do you say that?
This guy's ugly.
Now take a look at that woman right there. Does she look at all familiar to you?
No.
Not at all. What if I say that's you?
I bet not be me.
It is.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
So again, I mentioned like these folks won't even recognize their own face, right? As I'm pulling up the other video, any comments, reactions to what that must be like?
I'm still not feeling great, so I'm even more emotional, but these videos are making me cry. Like, it's awful.
Yeah, no, it is really hard for these folks, right? Especially in a world that's so based around facial recognition, right? Yeah. Any other reactions? Yeah, the heartbreaking. Yep. Yeah, it's so hard for, and yet she has a life as a professional photographer, right? She's able to like see where the face is, and I'm assuming get it in focus. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like navigating the world with a physical disability, right? And I guess it is in some ways, it's just not visible. So yeah, it can be really tough for these folks. All right, so some hope. These are some researchers at the university.
Prosopagnosia refers
Who are actually trying to find ways to treat it.
Prosopagnosia refers to an inability to recognize faces. So for somebody who has prosopagnosia, they can see a face, they know that the face is there, they can typically tell you that the face is smiling, the face is frowning, that particular person is happy, they're beautiful, all of these different other characteristics, but they cannot tell you who that person is.
But the amazing thing we can do with faces that almost everybody can do is put those properties, the nose, the face, the mouth, the relations between them, how hollow your cheeks are, just on and on and on, and create a way to recognize the relationships between all of those characteristics and take them in immediately and remember that particular individual, that particular person. The work that's been done on prosopagnosia focuses on adults, and it's been going on for several years. We're approaching the problem from a developmental point of view. We're interested in measuring and looking for children that have prosopagnosia.
To sort these pictures of female faces from the one you think is most pretty on your left, which one's your left? Do you know? This one. Try again.
Is we're bringing children into our lab, typically developing children that are coming from the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and greater area. And we're looking at the typical development of face processing in general in these children. So kids come into our lab and they complete a variety of games. A couple of them are memory games, so we present them with faces and then we ask them to identify the faces that they had just seen. Some are discrimination games, so they're shown a face and they're asked to kind of sort faces based on whether or not they're similar to a face, you know, a target face at the top, so they're discriminating between faces.
Underlying idea is that if we were to reach these children earlier than adults are being treated, we're hoping we're going to see more improvement than we're finding in research on adults.
I can see your face and all your features, like your nose and your ears and your mouth. I just can't tell the difference from like your nose and face to another person's. It's hard. I don't recognize my classmates. I don't know who's in my class. Like I don't even know, like, you know, I walk by them in the hall and there's a lot of people that I should know, but I don't, so it's just really hard because I don't want to seem like I'm rude or don't want to be their friend.
I think the percentage of kids who have it is surprisingly high. It isn't an extremely rare condition. It's sort of similar as prevalence to autism.
I think one of the main end goals that would be fabulous is if we had a way to identify prosopagnosia in a way that's reliable, and we had a way to treat prosopagnosia that was effective. If we could get those two things straightened out and really, throughout achieving those goals, really come to a better understanding of what's going on in developmental prosopagnosia.
We're hoping eventually to be able to really help these children who have these serious problems do better in their lives.
So apologies to the great people at University of Minnesota for whatever reason I thought it said Michigan instead of Minnesota. One thing I was Googling, you may have seen me looking down at my phone, is the percentage of people who are natural redheads is 1 to 2% of the population, right? So, and we don't necessarily not know about people who are redheads, right? So it's sort of interesting. Yeah, like Miranda's saying, she had no idea there were so many. Yeah, we just don't hear about this, right? Even though it may be fairly common. And as Oliver Sacks said in the video we watched last week, there's probably a spectrum, right? There's probably people who are like super recognizers. We all know those people who like have met you once and can recognize you the next time. I am not one of those people. I may be more like within the normal range for workers, but not as good side, right? And again, with the masks, it makes it even more challenging. And then we also, you know, have people who are really struggling with this. And even if we just look at a normal curve of ability to recognize faces, that 1 to 2% of people who would have the disorder makes sense statistically, right? Yeah, and yet it's something we don't necessarily hear about. That's a really good question. If masks have helped or hindered. I wonder if like, if someone wears the same type of mask every day, if that might help them. So like, I know one of the assistants at my daughter's school wears like the same pretty patterned, she must have like a bunch of pretty patterned floral masks, those types every day. So yeah, I'm wondering if that's like a point of facial recognition for people. Or I think I've mentioned before, other people on campus have said they recognize me by my hair. And there have been times where I have my hair slicked back and like up in a bun, where I've had administrators who've known me for years not recognize me until I was closer up. So yeah, many people have trouble recognizing people with masks, right? I'm starting to learn, y'all, and I think I am struggling a little bit because I didn't have that training last year like a lot of people did, right? Like I only saw folks this way. So I learned names really quick because they were right there in front of me, right? But yeah, I think that's, I can see masks kind of going either way and perhaps leveling the playing field, like Debbie said. I think that's a really good point. Sorry, I just realized I need to take attendance. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull up the participant list and take a screenshot so that I don't have to waste time doing that right now. Okay, there we go. And now I can look at that later. These are like the advantages of doing things on Zoom, as much as it's clearly not ideal. So, alrighty. Now I am going to backtrack and we'll talk about Blindsight a little. And so I'm going to show a couple different videos about this. We're going to start with one from the disc again, and then we'll go to another one that I have on YouTube. So I'll have to switch sharing in between those, but I'll probably show both before we chat. So, this one. Okay. Hello. Hello. There we go. I just have to be about 2 inches above it, apparently. There we go.
When Graham was 8 years old, he had an accident that damaged the part of his brain that processes vision. He can see, but he's not aware of seeing.
With this painting, with it being quite bright coloured, if I look over to the left of it, I'm completely unaware that there is a painting there at all. However, if we could get the painting to move very quickly, or somehow to flash it, I would be aware of an event occurring over here, and with it being a bright colour, I could probably see that it was coloured red. Again, with this painting being bright coloured, if I look to the left, I can't see it, but if we could get it to flash or move it, I could probably tell you that it had a lot of blue in it.
Graham has blind sight. He thinks he can't see anything on his right-hand side. Professor Lawrence Weiskrantz from Oxford University has been studying Graham's brain. He uses a laser light to draw shapes on Graham's blind side.
Okay. Graham, were you aware of anything in your blind field?
Yes.
What was it?
A circle going clockwise.
Yeah. But did you actually see it?
Didn't see it, no.
Graham says he can't see anything, but when he's forced to guess, he's able to trace the outline of the shapes with his hand. His brain receives information from his eyes without an image appearing in his mind. Can this information help us understand whether animals are conscious of what they see?
All right.
In 1996, experiments were conducted which some psychologists believe prove monkeys are conscious beings. This monkey has the same kind of damage that Graham has. She's seemingly blind on one side. The monkey can't tell us what she's aware of. Instead, she presses buttons and is rewarded with food. In this reconstruction of the experiment, the monkey is shown a green light either on her right, her blind side, or her left, and is supposed to press it. If she thinks there are no lights on, she presses the blue button. When the light is on her left, the monkey presses it. That's fairly straightforward. If none of the green buttons are lit, she presses the blue button. She's letting us know she's not aware of any green lights. Given a green light on her right side, the blind side, the monkey presses it. But she presses the blue button too, because she's not aware of seeing the green light. Normally, the
All right. So I'll stop that one there, but I just thought it was so cool that they figured out a way to test that in monkeys, right? Who have the similar thing where she's like, I see this, but I don't see this. It's just so cool. All right, now I'm going to screen share the next video. If I recall correctly, this is the guy where the scientist sounds like Arnold Schwarzenegger, which I love. So just getting the proper window. Here we go.
You're now, I would claim you're now awake, you're wide awake, and you can be aware of my face, of the fact what sort of, that I wear a colorful shirt, that I talk with this Schwarzenegger-like accent. And so this I would call an operationalized definition of consciousness.
Christophe, why have you and Francis Crick, who I guess is best known for discovering the structure of DNA, chosen visual awareness to study consciousness?
We believe that because consciousness is an evolved property, that probably nature discovered, it was discovered once during evolution, and the different forms of consciousness, i.e. visual consciousness, auditory consciousness, maybe even high-level self-consciousness, are probably just different variants of the same theme, the same mechanism.
So they've designed experiments to test visual consciousness. Eileen Wexler has normal vision, but this test simulates a phenomenon called unconscious vision, or blind sight, that can occur when there's damage to the brain's visual cortex.
So the world to them looks like this. They're blind in the left side of the visual field. And they go to the doctor, and the doctor says, well, can you see this? No. Well, can you guess whether it moves to the left or to the right? And the patient says, well, I'm blind. And the doctor says, well, guess. And the patient guesses left, right, up, down. And the patient is as surprised as the doctor, at least they were at first. And the point is that these patients, and there's now a quite substantial number of them throughout the world, they do not have conscious access to information in their blind hemisphere. Yet, if forced to respond, it turns out that something in their brain has information, because they can correctly guess, for example, the direction of motion. They can correctly, roughly point at a bright light. They can roughly say something about what colors is out there. No, it's very crude.
Senior research fellow Jochen Braun designed these blind sight experiments.
So let me show you the image one eye will see first. Okay, that's what it looks like. You have a background of squiggles all aligned.
Yes.
And there's this little area where the squiggles,
they're different.
They point at a right angle. Yeah. So I'll be asking you, where is this area, this different area?
It sounds easy, but during the experiment, the only thing I'm conscious of is a uniform pattern. Even though my left eye sees this, and my right eye sees this, my brain superimposes them. The theory is that some part of my brain will still know how to find the target, even though I'm not aware of it.
Now, the reason we do this is that the primary visual cortex, the first level of the brain which receives information from the eyes, receives information from left and right eye separately. So at this level, the brain can still figure out where the figure is.
Because it hasn't been superimposed.
It hasn't been superimposed, but at the next level in the brain, it's superimposed. So at that level, the brain is blind to where this figure is.
The glasses make sure that each of my eyes will see independently. Okay, here we go. I feel a bit foolish. I can't see any variation in the pattern. It seems impossible to find the target.
When we designed this experiment, we didn't know what would happen. And then the student who did the experiment came back and said, this is very strange. I'm rather good at finding the square, but I don't see it. So then it dawned upon us that this information which does make it to the brain, at least at the first level, you can still use it, but you're not aware of it.
The results haven't been consistent, but Aaron Rosen is one of the students who can sometimes locate the target 70% of the time, even though he's not conscious of it.
The theory of...
So I'll stop it there, because both these videos get more into consciousness and talking about this as a way to study consciousness, right? So if we don't have awareness of something, but we're still can react to it in some way, right? Then that can tell us something about what we're consciously aware of versus not. So reactions to a blind sight, again, our mind playing tricks on us, and what this might be like for someone navigating the world.
It's so hard to imagine that you're seeing something, but you're not. Like, I'm trying to process that and my brain just can't wrap around it. I would love to be able to do that experiment where it mimics it to see what that is really like.
Yeah, I think that would be great if we had that ability. Yeah, because yeah, that's a lot of these disorders that we'll talk about this semester. Is it's just so hard to imagine what it must be like to experience them, right? Yeah, and they can like see, especially movement in the corner, you know, in that visual field. Pretty interesting how the brain can do something like that to continue helping someone without actually helping them. Yeah, yeah, like our brains and our bodies in general do their best to kind of keep us alive and functioning at optimal as much as we can, right? Yes, this is actually, Miranda, spot on. This is very much like when someone has really bad seizures and they have to cut that corpus callosum, that crossover of the nerves between the two cortices, the two sides of the two hemispheres. Yeah, they can use both sides independently, and it can be really hard to get them to work together. The really interesting thing about that is when they cut the corpus callosum, that part we looked at earlier, right, where the optic nerves cross over, that's typically left intact. So people with the split brain, right, where they cut that corpus callosum, still have a little bit of communication between their two sides of the brain, but certainly not as much as they would when that giant corpus callosum is there. But yeah, Miranda's spot on. There are a lot of symptoms of split brain syndrome that are a lot like, can feel like blindsight, where it's essentially like you can be aware of something but not aware, or that you're aware of it on like the other side of your brain, if that makes sense. So like for split brain patients, they'll do stuff where they have, you know, a sheet or something up and have them do something behind, and you know, they can figure it out, but they can't always, you know, tell each part of the brain that the other exists, if that makes sense. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, I want to talk about synesthesia, and then if we have time, we'll come back and talk more about the anatomy of the eye and senses and things like that. But I think that it's much more fun, right? And probably much more new information for you all if we talk about some of these disorders. So synesthesia is the mixing of the senses, and it can occur in lots of different ways. And we're going to watch a couple of videos that give various explanations for it. Like some of the most common ones were that like it's where your visual parietal, or your like occipital, visual, and temporal lobes connect. They might sort of cross over is one of the theories, but you'll see one of the videos that kind of discredit that. So we don't really know why it happens. But Miranda, do you mind sharing what the experiences are like for you? And you can either type or unmute, whatever's easier for you.
I'm in the library, so I'll talk pretty quietly. But I have tactile gustatory synesthesia. So the insides of my hands, so like kind of my palms and the insides of my fingers, and the lower half of my face will elicit some sort of taste response when something touches them, but it's not the same response as it would be if I were to actually put that thing in my mouth. So the most similar is like keys and coins, metal. If I hold keys, it elicits a taste response very similar to if I were to actually like put a key in my mouth. But the most different is like brushing my hair. Running my hands through my hair elicits a response that's less of a taste and more of a feeling of like coldness.
Interesting. Wow. Thank you for sharing. That's really cool. So I'm going to start with the longer video I have by this about this. This is I think they call it a remix of a longer, like a 60-minute, I think, film. It's an 8-minute version that really gets at all the high points. So I'll start with this, and then I have like some news reports on it that, well, hang on, I need to actually share screen. That would be helpful to y'all.
Onions were pink, beer is blue, so peas are purple.
So about 150 years ago, people were very interested in synesthesia, and it sort of dropped out of the scientific consciousness for the last century. And the reason is the school of behaviorism took over, where people were interested in treating humans like black boxes, input-output devices. And you weren't allowed to talk about what it's like to be on the inside anymore. So people stopped being interested in consciousness and what it's like to actually perceive the world. And it's only in the last 20 years or so that the question has re-emerged. So synesthesia has had a real renaissance in the last couple of decades, where people want to understand what is the neural basis of perception, and how is it that some people perceive the world differently than other people? What is it like to see differently from the inside?
And I don't know when I necessarily first became aware of it, because it seems like it's always been there, but I know that I was definitely playing with it when I was 5 or 6 years old, because I remember raiding my parents' record cabinet, searching for records that I liked to listen to for the colors.
Synesthesia is an involuntary, unconscious, automatic linking of perceptions. A stimulus in one sense might trigger a perception in another sense.
It's just sort of always been just the way I think. It's just one has always been yellow, you know, certain letters have always been certain colors.
The days of the week are pretty, well, they're terribly consistent. Monday is red. And my mother said when I was 5 years old, no, Monday's blue, Blue Monday.
We don't hear with just our ears alone. We don't smell just with our noses. We don't taste just with our tongues.
Hey, wait a minute, Doc. After 20 years behind this camera, you're not going to tell me I don't see with my eyes, are you?
No, in a strict sense, you don't, Hal. Your eyes, like your other sense organs, simply receive impressions from the outside and send them on to the brain. The senses are all different. The signals are all alike.
Yeah, but then how could the brain know which sense is sending the message?
Well, you've just asked the big question. That brings us up to the brain.
This back portion of your brain is almost entirely devoted to vision, and there's a particular area of the brain that cares in particular about color. The part of your brain that would be sticking out here cares about language and words and letters, and somehow in a synesthetic brain these areas are connecting to these areas so that words and letters will trigger a color experience.
I have grapheme color synesthesia, and so basically I associate most letters and all numbers with some sort of color. One alone by itself is yellow, but 4 is also yellow, but it's a more golden yellow. Some of the differences are very, very subtle, but they're definitely distinct differences in my mind.
Synesthetic perceptions can be unpleasant every once in a while. But then again, so could your sense of smell. If you're able to smell something, you probably have experienced really pleasant odors like fresh baked cookies, your favorite home cooked meal, your favorite perfume, and you've also experienced very unpleasant odors, such as a filthy public restroom, or vomit, or manure. Right? Now, you've experienced extremely unpleasant odors. Do you want to permanently lose your sense of smell?
I definitely like having the color associations. It's an interesting thing to talk about, and it's kind of neat to have. And actually, once I realized that I could actually use colors to help me remember number sequences and things like that, that was actually kind of useful.
Synesthesia is not a disease. It's not a disorder. It's not something that is in any way a symptom of some other major problem. It's not something that you need to get rid of. It's an alternate way of perceiving the world.
For years I've been trying to understand, I'm not a synesthete, I've been trying to understand what it's like to have synesthesia. And the closest sort of analogy, which I think works, is something like this. If I were to show you a photograph of Barack Obama, you would immediately think Barack Obama. Even though those words aren't written anywhere there, just seeing his face, you would immediately think those words. An important thing to understand about synesthesia is it's not the same as a hallucination. So when a synesthete sees the letter T and experiences some sort of yellow in his mind's eye, it's not the same as a hallucination. He knows that the T is in fact in black ink and that there's not yellow out there. So it's not the sort of thing that would cause a car accident, and it's not the type of thing that would count as a hallucination or something one would have to worry about.
So the most popular theory to explain synesthesia is that in different areas of the brain, you actually have cross-wiring. You have more wiring in a synesthetic brain that causes these areas to talk to each other more. I don't favor that theory. Instead, I favor a second hypothesis, which is that the amount of wiring is the same in everybody's brain. Instead, what's different is there's a slight difference in the balance of excitation and inhibition, such that activity here will cause activity here, because there's not enough inhibition of that activity. The reason I favor the hypothesis that the wiring is the same in everybody is because non-synesthetes can experience synesthesia. So for example, when people take drugs like LSD or DMT, they'll experience synesthesia. Also, many non-synesthetes, when they're very fatigued, right when they're falling asleep, somebody might slam a door and they'll see colors. So this implies that everybody is capable of a synesthetic experience. Also, for synesthetes, the amount of their experience waxes and wanes. So for example, when they are drunk with alcohol, or they're very tired, or they're very emotional or stressed out, their synesthesia tends to be much richer and more intense. And in other cases, when they're on certain drugs like antidepressants, their synesthetic experience goes down. And this has the feeling of something that is involved in inhibition in the brain rather than wiring, because there's no reason to expect that your wiring would change based on emotion and fatigue and so on.
So it doesn't matter if my Tuesday is blue, green, or yellow. The fact that it's anything may or may not mean something to someone else, but if it does, it doesn't matter if his is orange or purple.
So it turns out what we learned from synesthesia is that some people perceive reality in a different way than the rest of us. And this is probably true in many different ways that we haven't even discovered yet. Synesthesia just happens to be a very good inroad into understanding how this works and what's different about some people's brains that causes them to have a different reality.
Hang on, let me stop the share. Just made you all disappear. Yeah, thanks to Debbie and Miranda for sharing their experiences and those of their family members in the chat. Yeah, it's something that in theory any of us could do, which says it's not a disorder, right? Just some people, just as we were just talking about, like facial recognition is probably on a normal curve, we probably have that for synesthesia too, right? And people way out at the end can experience this sort of all the time, whereas, you know, people in the middle might experience it more under the influence of substances, say. This reminds me of, I think it was in bio, is either bio or chem, I can't remember because I had them in the same classroom when I was in college, the same lab space, or in undergrad, or not even undergrad, high school, geez. And we watched this video where this guy was talking about how like he saw the most beautiful color purple he'd ever seen. It was in this museum and he came back on video and looked at it and he was like, yeah, now I can't see what I could see when I was high. Right? Like our experiences can be very different based on our environment, right? Or based on other factors going on around us. I've actually heard before, and I don't know how much this is true, but that basically if you have an experience where like, you know, for those of you who are of legal age, right, you have this great bottle of wine with a group of friends and, you know, the night just feels wonderful, that you should actually never try that wine again because it's never going to give you the same experience as that social setting did with it, which is really sort of an interesting idea about how much our environment and our consciousness, again, might influence other things going on with us. So what I'm pulling up right now is that we've spent a lot of time talking about visual. Obviously with synesthesia, we're getting into some of the other senses. And I We just want to talk with our 10 minutes or so we have left here about senses that some people don't even know that we have, which sounds a little like I'm making stuff up, right? But hopefully you realize I'm not. So essentially, this is senses that are not, taste, sight, sound, smell, and feel, right? So let me go ahead and share screen again here. Pull this up and share it. Nope, not share it. Present it. There we go. All right. There we go. So these are some of these senses that we experience, which again, often surprise people who are not as aware that these exist. Although once we think about it, of course, we experience these things, right? But for example, nociception is perception of unpleasant stimuli like pain and temperature. Right, so this is touch, but it's a much more nuanced part of touch, right? And we can also experience pain in areas that are not touch, right? If you ever accidentally looked at the sun, right? Your eyes can actually hurt. I don't know if anyone else had this experience, but when I first started doing everything online, my eyes would be sore at the end of the day, right? This is why when I'm not teaching, I actually will wear my glasses because they have the blue light filter in them. And that helps my eyes quite a bit. Right.
So,
oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
With something, I've experienced this and I've never really been able to explain it. Like, I've had dental problems and my tongue can feel pain, but it doesn't hurt. It's almost like it's just like a weird sensation that almost feels like metallic or something. It's very unusual and I've always wondered about it.
Yeah, and it could be just somehow your either the sensory receptors or just like with what we just watched, synesthesia. There we go. Yeah, it could be that essentially those neurons are related to each other, or what Miranda just talked about, referred to pain. That can happen as well. Or sometimes what can happen is you hold tension in a different place because of pain in another place, right? So yeah, I think all those could be, it could be any or all of those, right? And so there's also hapsis, which is fine touch and pressure, right? So things like a flutter or a vibration. I mean, I'm sure other people have experienced this now where you're not even carrying your phone, but you feel like you get a phantom vibration, right? It's almost like phantom limb syndrome for people. So it's this perception of objects using fine touch and pressure, again, which is slightly different. So we can get this from like our fingertips, for example, other parts of our skin, but also our hair receptors, right, can also give us indications of things. And then proprioception or bodily awareness have things to do with like our muscle stretch, our tendon stretch, our joint movement. People who are athletes often have very good proprioception. This is part of what went wrong for Simone Biles, right, at the Olympics, as she lost this ability, but then also sort of the balance and ability to find yourself in space. Right. And so again, it's about these things trying to communicate with your brain. Right. And when that connection is lost for whatever reason. Okay, I just saw Miranda's commented. I love it. That makes a lot of sense, right? Like kids who haven't developed this yet, that they necessarily realize that like something horrible could happen to them, right? Being thrown in the air. Why they like love that a lot. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? And I think for kids who probably have those experiences with no negative consequences, right, they might be more likely to go on to be people who are a little more of a daredevil, roller coaster lovers, even, extreme sports. people, whether it's snowboarding or honestly gymnastics, right? It's interesting to me, like, you know, in snowboarding, we talk about this 560, and like I had never really thought about it, but some of the YouTube videos I've watched about gymnastics actually describe the moves in the same sort of like, oh, this is a 720 or whatever, and you're like, whoa, you know. So there are definitely lots of sports that kind of require very good fine tuning of that, and also a sense of courage, or not as much fear, maybe because you trust these senses so much. So I think that that's really important aspect of this as well. Alrighty, so let me stop sharing that. Yes, Amanda, these are the sub-modalities under question 14 on the SGA. So yep, you are spot on. Yes, Debbie, if you are a clumsy person, you may have a lack of that. Yeah, definitely. Well, and it's so interesting because I don't know if any of you who are athletes have experienced this. I certainly did when I used to dance. But sometimes the people who like in the moment, in when they need it, are the best at this, are the worst at this when they are navigating things. Oh, so Amanda, the fourth one is balance. Yeah, which wasn't on the slide. Yeah, and that's actually why I ended the slides, is I wanted to see if there are any other questions that came up for people on the SGA, or just as we went through, that I can answer for you. Again, you feel free to type them in the chat or unmute yourself, whatever works. Alrighty, if not, I will let you all go a couple minutes early. Thursday, we're going to start talking about disorders of the motor system. We will do a case study. Plan on doing this on Zoom unless you hear otherwise from me, that I like miraculously find out everyone in my house is fine. And what we'll do for the case study is I'll just put you into breakout rooms and make a Google Doc for the case study worksheet, and y'all can just type your responses into there. And then I could share it with everybody, and you don't necessarily have to scribble it all down unless that helps you. So thank you. Me too. She's got a fairly decent immune system, so my hope is that everything will be okay. And they have been wearing masks, but you know, they're 3-year-olds wearing masks, so I'm not sure how good they are at them all day. So good, given that I've seen college students and faculty and staff who aren't very good at it, right? So yeah, I'll stick around for a couple minutes in case anyone else has any other questions. If not, then I will see you on Thursday. Again, anticipate this way.
Bye.